The verdict. The golden sunlight gleamed off the grand courthouse steps as the crowd gathered outside, murmuring with anticipation. It was one of the most talked-about cases in the country, a corruption trial involving a group of high-ranking police officers accused of misconduct, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. For weeks, the courtroom had been filled with explosive testimonies, shocking evidence, and emotional pleas from victims who had suffered at the hands of officers sworn to protect them. The prosecution had presented a compelling case, but as the trial progressed, doubts started creeping in. Would justice truly be served? Or would these officers, shielded by years of authority and influence, walk free once again? Among the spectators standing outside the courthouse was Jordan Hayes, a striking woman in her late 30s, her long braided hair cascading over her sharp black suit. She stood still, poised, watching the unfolding events with an expression that revealed nothing. No one knew who she was. Not yet. Inside the courtroom. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension as the jury filed back into the room, their faces unreadable. The judge, an older woman with stern eyes, called for silence. The lead defendant, Captain Richard Monroe, sat with his fellow officers, Sergeant Paul Henson, Lieutenant Travis Reed, and Officer Mark Collins, men who had, for years, operated above the law, untouchable. Their attorney, a seasoned defense lawyer known for getting the guilty off the hook, sat beside them, confidence radiating from every inch of his perfectly tailored suit. The judge turned to the jury. Has the jury reached a verdict? A woman in a navy blue blazer stood, her hands trembling slightly as she held the paper. We have, Your Honor. The entire room held its breath. The clerk took the slip of paper, handed it to the judge, and she read it aloud. On the count of abuse of power, we'd find the defendants not guilty. Gasps rippled through the room. The courtroom erupted. Some shouted in anger. Others sat in stunned silence. Jordan Hayes, standing at the back, remained perfectly still. The judge continued. On the count of obstruction of justice, we find the defendants not guilty. More gasps. The officers at the defense table exchanged smug smiles. Their attorney gave a small smirk as if this outcome had been inevitable. Finally, the judge reached the final charge. On the count of misconduct in public office, we find the defendants. A pause. The tension crackled like electricity. Not guilty. Chaos exploded inside the courtroom. Victims and their families cried out in disbelief. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. And the officers? They grinned. Monroe turned to his team, shaking hands as if they had just won a championship game. They had gotten away with it. Again. The defense attorney patted Monroe's back. Told you. The system works. For a moment, it seemed like the world had failed, like corruption had won. But what none of them knew was that justice was coming, and it was coming in the form of Jordan Hayes. The celebration. Outside the courthouse, the officers emerged to cheers from their supporters, a small but vocal group who saw them as heroes rather than villains. Cameras flashed, reporters called out questions, but Monroe just laughed, shaking hands with his fellow officers. It was a witch hunt, he told the press, his voice dripping with arrogance. But truth prevails. We're going back to work, and we're going to continue serving this city like we always have. The other officers chuckled, nodding in agreement. Then one of the reporters asked, "What do you have to say to those who believe justice wasn't served today?" Monroe's smirk widened. They'll get over it. The officers clasped hands in victory. And that's when Jordan Hayes stepped forward. Her movement was slow, deliberate. She walked toward the officers, her sharp black suit tailored to perfection, her expression unreadable. The energy shifted. Some in the crowd turned, noticing her presence. The officers were still too caught up in their celebration to realize they were being watched. Monroe, hearing the sudden quiet, finally noticed her. He frowned. "Can I help you, lady?" he asked, his voice laced with condescension. Jordan didn't answer. Instead, She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a single black badge case. Slowly, methodically, she flipped it open. The golden badge inside caught the sunlight. And then she spoke. "Congratulations, gentlemen. You're celebrating early." She snapped the case shut. "I'm Jordan Hayes, your new FBI director." Silence. For a second, Monroe's smug expression faltered. Then Henson let out a laugh. "This some kind of joke." Jordan tilted her head, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Does it look like I'm joking?" Monroe narrowed his eyes. "I don't care who you are, lady. We're done here." Jordan smirked. "You were done the moment you walked out of that courtroom." And then, it happened. A fleet of black SUVs pulled up to the curb. FBI agents in dark suits stepped out in synchronized motion, their presence a stark contrast to the chaos. The air shifted. The officers, who had just been celebrating their supposed victory, froze in place. The press went silent. Jordan took a step closer, lowering her voice so only Monroe and his men could hear. "You may have escaped this trial," she murmured, "but your time is up. You thought the law didn't apply to you." She leaned in slightly. "Well, now it does." Monroe stiffened. "You have nothing on us." Jordan smirked again. "Oh, we have plenty. You see, gentlemen, your case was just the beginning. I spent months digging deeper into every cover-up, every backdoor deal, every abuse you thought would never see the light of day." She stepped back. "And now we're opening a federal investigation." Henson's face drained of color. "You can't." Jordan cut him off. "Oh, I can. And I have." She turned to the agents standing by. "Take them." And just like that, the FBI moved in. One by one, the officers were placed under federal custody. This wasn't about the state trial they had escaped. This was about federal crimes. Crimes that carried real weight. Crimes that meant they wouldn't be walking free this time. As the agents secured the scene, Jordan looked Monroe in the eyes one last time. She saw fear, and for the first time, she smiled. Checkmate. The hunt begins. The fall of untouchable men. The handcuffs clicked shut. One by one, the officers who had walked out of court as free men were now being taken into federal custody. Their once smug faces had transformed into shocked disbelief as FBI agents surrounded them. The crowd, which had just moments before been a mix of anger and resignation, erupted into cheers and gasps. Monroe, the ringleader of the corrupt officers, turned toward Jordan Hayes, his face red with fury. "You can't do this," he hissed, struggling as two agents gripped his arms. "We were just acquitted. Double jeopardy. This is unconstitutional." Jordan merely raised an eyebrow, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "Oh, you misunderstand, Captain Monroe," she said, taking slow, measured steps toward him. "This isn't about those charges." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough for him to hear. "This is about everything else you thought we wouldn't find." For the first time, Monroe's confidence wavered. He knew he had covered his tracks. Or so he thought. The real case unfolds. For months, Jordan Hayes had been working behind the scenes, building a case so airtight that not even the best defense lawyers could rip it apart. The state trial had been a test, a way to see how deep the corruption ran. But federal investigations, that was the real endgame. While Monroe and his men had been arrogantly celebrating their acquittal, the FBI had already been finalizing a mountain of evidence against them. Jordan turned to an agent who had just arrived, handing her a folder marked classified. "Get this over to the DOJ," she instructed. "We're charging them with racketeering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and civil rights violations." Monroe froze. Henson stopped struggling. Reed and Collins exchanged panicked glances. "You're bluffing," Monroe growled. Jordan smiled. "Try me." Secrets unearthed. The truth was, Jordan had known about Monroe and his crew long before this trial. She had been watching, waiting, calculating. Their crimes stretched far beyond misconduct. They had been involved in illegal asset seizures, falsifying reports, planting evidence, and taking bribes. And now, the entire case was laid bare. She walked over to Monroe, whose hands were now bound behind his back. "You thought a not guilty verdict made you untouchable?" she asked, tilting her head. "That just means the state failed. But me, I don't fail." "You're setting us up," Monroe spat. Jordan chuckled. "No, Captain. You set yourself up. I just followed the trail of dirty money, falsified case files, and intimidation tactics you left behind." Anders, who had been standing silently this whole time, finally snapped. "This is a damn witch hunt," he shouted, jerking against his restraints. "I want my lawyer." Jordan smiled coldly. "Don't worry," she said. "You're gonna need one." The backlash. As the news spread, the country exploded. Within hours, every major news outlet was broadcasting footage of the corrupt officers being arrested by the FBI, mere minutes after their acquittal in state court. It was unprecedented. The same courthouse steps where Monroe had once stood boasting about his victory were now the place where he and his team were being dragged away in disgrace. Families of victims cried tears of relief. Community leaders hailed Jordan Hayes as the hero they had been waiting for. But not everyone was happy. The system strikes back. Behind closed doors, powerful people were panicking. City officials, police unions, judges, even politicians. The old guard, those who had allowed Monroe and his men to operate unchecked for years, saw this as a direct threat. And they were right. In a sleek, dimly lit office, Mayor Alan Reeves sat at his desk, his jaw clenched as he watched the news coverage. Across from him sat Commissioner David Grayson, the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the city. "This is bad," the commissioner said, rubbing his temples. "This isn't just some random DOJ investigation. This is targeted. Hayes is going for the entire system." Reeves exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against the desk. "This is a problem," he agreed. "If she succeeds, she'll dismantle everything we've built." Grayson scoffed. Don't act like you're clean in all this, Alan." The mayor shot him a sharp look. "We need to get ahead of this," Grayson continued. "We need to put pressure on the Bureau, remind them who really runs this city." The mayor's gaze darkened. "And if that doesn't work?" A long pause. "Then," Grayson smirked, "then we remind Jordan Hayes that she isn't invincible." Jordan's next move. Back at FBI headquarters, Jordan sat in her private office, reviewing the next phase of the case. Monroe's arrest was just the beginning. She knew the real fight was only starting. Her phone buzzed. An encrypted message. "Unknown sender. They're coming for you. Be ready." Jordan smirked. She had expected this. She locked her phone, leaned back in her chair, and whispered to herself, "Let them try." The reckoning. The trap is set. The walls of power were closing in. But Jordan Hayes had been waiting for this moment. She had spent years playing chess while the corrupt played checkers. Now, it was time for the final move. For weeks after the arrests of Monroe and his officers, the media had been in a frenzy. Major figures in law enforcement were squirming, worried that they were next. The FBI's investigation had turned the entire city upside down. And that was exactly what Jordan wanted. She knew that when systems built on corruption started to fall, those who had profited from them would do anything to protect themselves, including coming after her. The threats began. It started with whispers in political circles. Then came smear campaigns on the news. Reporters, paid by powerful figures, painted Jordan as too aggressive, a woman on a vendetta. Then came the threats. An envelope left on her desk. Inside, a bullet. A message clear as day. "Back off." Jordan simply chuckled. Whoever had sent it had underestimated her. The secret meeting. One evening, as the city skyline glowed under the moonlight, Jordan received an anonymous message. It was an invitation. A meeting with someone who had valuable information. A whistleblower from inside the corrupt system. Jordan arrived at a dimly lit parking garage, her instincts sharp, her hand never far from her weapon. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was Commissioner David Grayson, the man who ran the city's police force. Jordan smirked. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said coolly. Grayson looked tense. He wasn't here as an ally. "You need to stop this, Hayes," he said, his voice low. Jordan crossed her arms. "Or what? You'll send another message." Grayson's jaw tightened. "This goes higher than you think. You're making enemies you can't afford." Jordan took a slow step forward, her eyes cold and sharp. "I don't care how high this goes," she said. "The people you've protected for years, they're done." Grayson exhaled sharply. "You think you're a hero, but you're just one person. They'll destroy you." Jordan let out a small chuckle. "That's where you're wrong," she said. And then, the FBI swarmed the parking garage. Dozens of agents emerged from unmarked vehicles, their weapons drawn. Jordan smiled as she pulled a small recording device from her pocket. Grayson's face drained of color. She had just recorded his confession. "Thanks for playing your part," she said. "You just made my job easier." The final blow. The next morning, the city awoke to a scandal unlike any before. Grayson's secret dealings had been exposed. He was arrested on live television, and with him, the dominoes fell. Politicians, judges, businessmen. One by one, the system Jordan had fought against collapsed. For the first time in decades, the city had a chance at real justice. Monroe and his men. They were convicted on federal charges and sent to prison for life. Grayson, he flipped to save himself, taking down even bigger names in the process. And Jordan, she stood at the courthouse steps, watching the fallout of her work. Reporters shouted questions. "Director Hayes, how does it feel to take down the most powerful figures in the city?" Jordan paused, letting the moment sink in. Then she simply said, "It's about time." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a city forever changed. The fight wasn't over. But for today, justice had won. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.